I told you he took part of his philosophy from the Shema, and that's from Deuteronomy 6, where it talks about, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one." And up until this point, I was very aware of pantheism. What is pantheism again?
God and matter.
Right, God is all. All is God. And so for Spinoza, you have this concept of the totality of reality is one. And you can call it God or nature. It doesn't matter to him. Because if you remember, his solution to Descartes' mess, that Cartesian dualism problem, and for reminders, because all the other philosophers are going to deal with this as well, all the way until Kant, in the Cartesian dualism, we have René Descartes positing God as this primary substance, but then God expresses himself in these different modes of being. On this side we have thought, and on this side we have extension. And this becomes the classic mind-body problem. And hopefully you enjoyed my illustration. It's a problem because of us. We have minds and bodies, and somehow we're able to interact. I can do stuff like this. That's amazing when you think about it. With a thought, I can move matter. But why can I move this particular matter, but I can't move that matter or this matter unless I'm using matter to move it? And so he left us with this big dilemma. We talked about Hobbes' solution was to simply get rid of this whole metaphysical side and say, let's just focus on the stuff we can actually measure, study, etc. And even though he's using theistic language, he's talking like a materialist, like almost like Aristotle again, like this is real. I mean, this is more like incidentals. Like we have a mind because we have a brain, but this becomes almost like a shadow of the reality. Spinoza is like, no. These are only two of infinite ways God manifests himself. But there is only one substance. And if you remember back to the scholastics, substance is defined as that which is self-existing and self-consisting. And by that definition, you really can't get around God is the only being or even concept that fits that definition. And so therefore, you can talk about mind or body as synonyms, because it's really talking about God expressing himself. And so here we could simply put what ends up happening is people, because this is like the non-tangible side, they end up thinking, well, God must be over here and nature's over here. But that's not what Descartes is saying. But for Spinoza, it's easy because this is all really equals this. I knew lots of missionaries that would come back from Southeast Asia, India in particular, when I was growing up Baptist fundamentalists, and they would talk about the backwardness and ignorance of these people. And part of the ignorance was they were saying, like, you wouldn't believe it, these people are actually worshiping stone idols. And as a little kid, I'm just thinking, wow, that's like the Old Testament. People really are doing, it was the 20th century back then, but people are still worshiping wood and stone and metal in the 20th century. And I just shared with their thought, well, yeah, how ignorant. Until I met Baruch Spinoza, and the other thing that changed my mind was I finally read the Upanishads, like a 7th century AD Hindu Veda, one of the latest of the Hindu Vedas, where they explain this concept of pantheism. So this is going to be your pantheism primer, and it will come in handy the second half of the class. So if God and nature, if this is the totality of reality, but then I ask a question, like Justin God, are you God?
No, not at all.
Okay, so now we have the totality of reality plus Justin Cobb.
Hope you don't mind me using your real name.
No, it's all good.
Okay. I'm a dirty rag.
What about my coffee mug? That beautiful platonic ideal form, or as close as you can get on this side of the veil. Is that God? If you want to say no, now we have God, Justin, and my coffee mug. What about those beautiful palm trees outside? Are they God? If you want to say no, now we got Justin, my coffee mug, and all the trees. Do you see the problem? If we keep going and keep naming, each time I name something, it now is like God is minus whatever being or reality Justin has. God is now minus whatever being or reality my mug has. God is now minus all the forests in the world. God is now minus whatever. And now all of a sudden, God begins to look like this cosmic Swiss cheese when we begin to name all the things that God is not. And by the time we get to the end of the modern period, they have reasoned God right out of his own universe. And poof, God does not exist. What we have is the universe and naturalistic materialism, but no God. For the Hindus, they see the physical material as the illusion, right? It's much more in that Platonic vein. It's the ideal, the spirit, the mind. That's the eternal reality. Spinoza is quite comfortable saying, no, there is only one thing, and all these other, you're a mode of God's existence. Justin, so you get to be back in here, my mug gets to be in here, the forest, everything comes back into God where it belongs, because there is no other place. Just like Parmenides is, there is only one thing. In this case, the one thing is God, but the one thing is also nature. So now, instead of thinking, what an ignorant religion or worldview, I'm thinking, uh-oh, this actually makes so much more sense to me than dualism, where like that Gnostic dualism, where you have the spirit realm and this physical realm. This is simply saying there's only one realm, and you can talk about it spiritually or you can talk about it physically, but you're really only talking about one thing, because only one thing's happening. Any other questions about Spinoza before we go to our the next guy out of our chute? All right, next for your viewing pleasure, I'm going to give you George Friedrich Wilhelm Leibniz. Make sure I spell him right. And Leibniz is a German philosopher. We kind of see philosophy migrating north up from Greece, Rome, into Italy, France, now these Germanic philosophers. And Leibniz, also a mathematician, mathematics, this is like the beginning of the modern scientific method is coming on in this time period. We've got Copernicus. What was Copernicus's claim to fame?
The Earth was the center of, or sorry, the sun was the center of the solar system.
Right, the heliocentric universe, right? And then later, that's confirmed by Galileo, because Galileo, they had developed telescope technology with lenses. And Galileo was able to see one of the moons of Jupiter, and that changed everything. Why would seeing a moon on Jupiter change everything? If you were previously a terracentric, you believed everything orbited around Earth, and now you see a moon around Jupiter. What's the problem? Right, there's something out there not orbiting around us, which now you can begin to infer, well, maybe it's way worse than that, to the point with telescopes and mathematics, they were able to determine that it is us who is moving, but other things could be moving too, but we're not there yet. Right now, people are getting this rude awakening that we may not be the end-all be-all of this universe, and so it's affecting the mentality of people. Leibniz, though, he is a Christian philosopher, and his emphasis is really to show how God is still sovereign, he's still in control. So even though he's a modern philosopher, he's very much tied into this medieval tradition of we have this belief in God, we believe he's a good God, an all-powerful God, And if you accept those presuppositions, he believes you logically have to come to the conclusion that this world is the best of all possible worlds. Because why would a perfect God make a less than best world? And you might say, but this world is so broken, Blackburn. There's so much sin and disease and death. But the point is, it's not about the egocentric pleasure and desires of human beings. It's about this world, for whatever reason, maximizes God's goodness and glory. And brokenness is part of how he is able to actually pour out his glory into the world and have it return unto himself. Okay, so this is where Leibniz's head is. And part of how he talks about this, he talks about this concept called monads in his mondology. And a monad, I do not believe it has dimensionality, and I don't even think it has windows into the outside universe or world, but it's almost like my understanding, which is very limited at best, of like this foam theory of the universe, which is competing with like string theory. And this idea that the universe is actually comprised, like if you've ever done dishes in a sink, and there's like all these like little bubbles, right? And they fill in every little gap in space. This is kind of what I think he's meaning by monads. And they completely fill all of the universe, but they're like all holograms related to each other. So they each have their particular place and function and time, but it has all been orchestrated from all eternity by the mind of God. So everything is as it should be. Everything is in its proper place. The people that aren't in the class today, there's no way they could be in this class today, because the universe God created did not have them here today. He has them out doing something else, interacting in other ways with other monads in that sense, and they're fulfilling this plan of God. So I'm going to draw a timeline to try to illustrate this and what it looks like. And part of what Leibniz is bringing in is some of Aristotle's distinction between potentiality and actuality. And I hope this expands your view of God today. That's my goal. You'll leave this room thinking, wow, God's way bigger than I thought before. That's at least how Leibniz affects my mind. And so I'm just going to do my abbreviated timeline of Fred, but you all we could have 30 timelines going on up here, but I just want to show you this one to make a point. Okay, so when I was born, back in 1962, 60s child, I could have been born quiet, I could have been born crying, or I could have been born laughing. The Fred that was born quiet, that needed to be slapped to open up my lungs, that's not the one God brought into the world. The one that was born crying already is not the one God brought into the world. But the Fred Blackburn that came out laughing, that's the one standing here before you today. Okay. Now this Fred travels down, and then when he's like 5, his folks give him a choice. You can have a goldfish, a bird, or a dog. The Fred that would have chose the goldfish, God did not actualize, or the bird, but the Fred that had his little beagle, that's the one you see before you today. Okay. So remember Spinoza's only one thing's happening, but from our perspective, it looks like there's all these potentialities. This is kind of like Leibniz's version of this. And then it goes on and on. There's a Fred, let's skip ahead a bit, that after he graduated high school, he could have gone to San Diego State, he could have come to Christian Heritage College, which is now San Diego Christian College, or he could have just wandered off into the hills. Well, that Fred that went into the hills didn't happen, the one that went to state didn't happen, but the one that came here did happen. And then there was a Fred that could have conformed and obeyed. There's a Fred that could have maybe found a wife and married, or there was a Fred that couldn't take it anymore and then went into the mountains. And that is the Fred you see today. So after a year of college, I'm just like freaked out of my mind. I don't even know what's happening with Christendom or myself or the world. And I'm having these real problems. I wish I would have known about Leibniz back then. I don't know if it would have helped me, but intellectually it might have helped me. Because Leibniz is trying to assure us, Fred, you are making these are real choices I'm making. But God in his sovereignty is only actualizing the Fred that made this series of choices. Because it's this series of choices which is going to lead to his maximum glory and goodness in the world. So this Fred that went into the mountains, he could have stayed in the mountains. That's not the Fred you see here, right? Because I'm here. There's the one that could have jumped off a cliff and killed himself in despair, or there's the one who could have come back down from the mountain and gone back to school. Now, this Fred could have come back to San Diego Christian, he could have gone to San Diego State, or he could have said, I want something a little more intense. I want to find the most conservative school in the country, and that is the Fred you see standing before you. Yada, yada, yada. Then there's the Fred that could have thrived there, married, or fled back to California, and that is the one you see before you here. Once again, this Fred that came back to California. Now, your timelines haven't even started yet, most of you, which that's tripping me out, right? But what's going to happen is, on this timeline, once we get to, good Lord, the late 20th century, some of you, okay, you're going to start coming in, and now you're going to have little dots with your own timelines, which are all going to come and converge at this place and time in this classroom where I'm giving this lecture. All of you have your own time. Do you know the impossible odds of us all being here together at this time for this talk? But Leibniz is saying it could not have been otherwise. When you ran that red light and mushed that kitty and you feel awful and you just are overwhelmed with grief, rest assured, it could not have been otherwise. That was the you. There were other yous that did not take that route, that did not run over that cat. But the you that ran over that cat for whatever reason was part of God's great plan for the best of all possible worlds. And then we're all going to leave this place, right, with all our different choices, like I told you about even walking out that door. And these are all going to converge again in the sweet by and by, where everything will culminate together. All humanity from Adam to the last person in this glorious return. And so, like Spinoza, Leibniz is saying, yes, there are many potentialities, but there is only one actuality. And this becomes the life of Fred. And whether I do good or evil or in between, God is actualizing the Fred that's making those choices that are most aligned with his glory. Questions, comments? I'm not saying this is how it is, but I'll tell you, it sure helps me sleep better at night. Because in a way, he's preserving free will, because those are real choices. But God's sovereignty is, he's only actualizing the choices that align with what he's doing. But he has the capacity to take whatever choice you make and work it into his glory. Like Romans 8 tells us, right? All things work together for good. Even, and it's all going to work out for God's good. For other people, they might be kind of like the darkness in the tapestry of life that makes the colors pop. I mean, I don't want to be the darky dooky colors of life, right? But there's vessels of honors, vessels to dishonor. God creates some people for glory and other for destruction. And you might just say, that's so unfair. Yeah, well, I wouldn't argue that. But it's God. It's his dealio. But, yeah, in the back and then up to Ryan. Tell me your name again.
Francisco.
Francisco.
I was just wondering, I'm a little confused on what exactly Monads is. I understand.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I understand.
Because it's hard to think in terms of something, the part that throws me is the non-dimensionality piece of it. But it's almost like this being piece. Like, Fred is a monad. Francisco is a monad.
Okay.
And actually, you're doing what God has created you to do. You're still making choices. Like, you chose to ask me that question. But God already knew you would ask me that question. The Francisco that would have just sat there and kept his mouth shut is not the one God made. But I don't get the part of, it's almost like each monad is independent. It's not that causal, like, domino effect we think of in that linear cause and effect sort of thing. This is simply God, but it's all pre-programmed in each monad to fire and act and speak and move as God has created them. But they're making those choices. God's creating the monads that would make the choices in accordance with his plan or purpose. Now, does this make God the author of evil? No, because it's those people choosing evil. God is somehow taking that evil and transforming it into good. Did any of you ever read the Silmarillion? It was Tolkien's, like, creation of Middle-earth. And the god of Middle-earth sings the creation into existence. Awesome. If you're familiar with Native American creation account, the Hopi creation account is the same way. The Hopi creator sings. It's like the harmony of God is the world. But people did not want to sing in harmony with the creator. They wanted to march to the sound of their own drum. They wanted to make their own tune. And it creates discordance. But God in his glory in the Silmarillion is able to take the discordance and actually magnify his symphony, his cosmic symphony, by taking in the contrast and bringing about resolution. Fantastic. And I think Leibniz is sharing a very similar view here, even though he's before Tolkien. But this idea of God's perfect plan, purpose, perfect place is taking us, and so we can rest. We can be at peace. You don't have to have anxiety and stress. Do you still have to think about your choices? Yeah, because you're still making real choices. But in a sense, you could say the choices have already been made. You're kind of just living out life, trying to figure out why he made them. Okay. Any other questions, comments? I told you it was going to get weirder. I thought the ancient Greeks were out there. They just keep building off each other, right? It's just like, ooh, where can we go next? And we're not done. All right. So after Leibniz, nothing else you want to know about Leibniz? Now we're going to have a contrast between Locke and Berkeley. So I want to come back over this way with you. I'm going to do these two together. Anyone know anything about John Locke?
Is he the life, liberty, pursuit, happiness guy?
Yep. He was kind of a contrast with Rousseau, the French philosopher, who saw, if only we could get back to nature, right? Nature is utopic. Everyone could have their own vine. We'd all live in peace and harmony. But people like Hobbes and Locke are like, no, nature is tooth and claw and violence and eat or be eaten. And that's why we have to give up part of our power to have like a Leviathan or a ruler or a king or a president. But that's not what I want to talk about, John Locke. I mean, in a lot of ways, people call America a Lockean experiment. I mean, a lot of our ideas about running a democratic republic come from John Locke. And so he's very significant in the history of our culture and our people. And this idea of where does power come from? Does it come from the top down or does it come from the people up, right? So that's very much a part of American values or political ideals, at least in large. I want to contrast him with a guy named George Berkeley. And I know it looks like Berkeley, and in fact, I'm pretty sure the city of Berkeley, California is named after George Berkeley. It's one of those This picture might be a little scary, so just try to bear with it. So John Locke comes up with this idea called the Tabula Rasa. And the Tabula Rasa just means blank slate. And so he believes when we're born into this world, our minds are like this blank slate. And with the senses, he believes there's an actual physical material world out here, a world full of coffee mugs, trees, and people. And he believes as these sense impressions are brought into us, and that could be through smell, taste, touch, hearing, sight, it imprints, and I don't know why, but upside down in our brains, and our mind interprets this stuff. And then we can use reason, so sense impression, empiricism plus reason allows us to take objects in the world and create new and novel concepts or ideas or extrapolate or infer knowledge. So if I'm a little kid playing with a basketball in my front yard and my mom has told me 1,000 times don't play in the street, and one day the basketball goes over the fence into the street and I watch a truck flatten it, I can extrapolate, well, my head's kind of shaped like a basketball. If that truck hit my head, I bet something similar would happen that what happened to that basketball. So now I'm using reason to fill in information that I haven't even perceived directly. And so he does believe in the use of reason, but he believes primarily, like Aristotle, you have to start with the physical material world, and then that feeds you ideas. Well, George Berkeley has about had it with these empiricists and people who believe only what you see is reality, and he's saying, no, it's not like that. So once again, we got Locke kind of on this side, the physical side, right? But Berkeley is saying, no, it's not a tabula rasa we're born with. Rather, we are born with all knowledge possible already existing inside of us. Almost like it's on a disc or a reel-to-reel. Remember Plato said you already know everything there is to know? And he's just kind of like a midwife birthing thought babies. Well, the tree, the coffee mug, and the people exist here. And we are projecting them out into the physical material world. Plato and Aristotle, it's like they've been reincarnated or something in the 17th century. Said we have the same stinking argument happening all over again. What's primary? What's real? How do we know things? Is it because there's an external world that we take in, we analyze, or it's because we already have all knowledge contained within, and we're literally like reality generating machines? When I walk into a room, the room materializes before me. Did the room exist before I walked into it? That becomes the question. And that was the critics of Berkeley. People are saying, come on, Berkeley. Say there's some frog sitting by the river, and he's watching the water go by, but all he can see, because of his limited frog vision, is this much of the river. Are you telling me the river's just appearing and disappearing out of the vision of this frog? Because maybe when he was a tadpole, he lived upriver, and he knew it came from a waterfall high in the mountains. And other frogs told him, yeah, if you follow it down, it takes you to a broad sea with waves, and you can't even see any land, yada, yada, yada. Berkeley's retort was, oh, you egocentric little humans. It's not your perception that fixes reality, but God's. And there is nothing that God doesn't see at any time. If God stopped perceiving anything at any time, it would cease to exist. And here's some great hope for you, a little theological hope. What is it about us that God does not perceive? There's one thing God doesn't perceive about us. If you be in Christ. Our sin. Which means, at least according to Berkeley, out of sight, out of mind, out of reality. Woo! Thank you, Jesus. When I first learned about Berkeley, I could not stop thinking about like a cosmic conveyor belt. Did any of you ever see Stephen King's Langoliers? Where they're trapped in this weird thing, but as yesterday is coming, it's eating, time is eating away. It's just disappearing, and the future is, it's being created in front of us. So it's almost like this, if you've ever been in the desert, driving on this highway where you can see like 100 miles, and you're looking on the horizon, and as you're driving, it's like reality's coming up on the horizon, and when you look in the rearview mirror, you see it disappearing behind you. It's so freaky when you think about that. I mean, it takes is the light on in the refrigerator question to a whole nother level, right? It's not asking about the lighting, more it's like, is there even anything in there when I'm not looking? And when I do look, it is. And that's part of why I showed you that What the Bleep Do You Know movie. Remember about superposition? How it's not electrons, protons, neutrons, they're not moving in these neat little linear patterns like in this space-time area where we are as humans. Newtonian physics work perfectly well for us at this level of reality. But when you start to get to the quantum field, it gets freaky-deaky. It doesn't work the same way. And so now instead of having electrons moving like planets around the sun, we have a field or a cloud of potentiality of where that electron may be. When you look at it, it locks into place. When you look away, it goes back to potentiality. Potentiality, actuality. Actuality. And so it's putting this emphasis on its actual perception that creates reality. Hence, his little jingle is, to be is to be perceived. Questions, comments about these guys? All right, I'm going to show you a little clip, so you might want to come here. And I don't know how much I'll show you of this, but it will either help or hurt you. Would you pull down the rest of that line for me? Can you get that one for me? My OCDs. Thank you.
Outlook on the material world. The content of this film is not just a different approach or a philosophical thought. It is a fact, which is also proven by science today. Man is conditioned right from the beginning of his life that the world he lives in has an absolute material reality. So he grows up under the effect of this conditioning and builds his entire life on this viewpoint. The findings of modern science, however, have revealed a completely different and significant reality than what is presumed. All the information that we have about the external world is conveyed to us by our five senses. The world we know of consists of what our eyes see, our ears hear, our noses smell, our tongues taste, and our hands feel. man is dependent on only those 5 senses since birth. That is why he knows the external world only the way it is presented by these senses. Yet, scientific research carried out on our senses has revealed very different facts about what we call external world. And these facts have brought to light a very important secret about matter, which makes up the external world. Contemporary thinker Frederick Bester explains the point that science has reached on this subject. Statements of some scientists posing that man is an image, everything experienced is temporary and deceptive, and this universe is a shadow, seems to be proven by science in our day. In order to better grasp this secret behind matter, let us be reminded of our information about our sense of sight, which provides us with the most extensive information about the external world. The act of seeing is realized progressively. At the instance of seeing, light clusters called photons travel from the object to the eye and pass through the eye lens, where they are refracted and focus on the retina at the back of the eye. Here, rays are turned into electrical signals and then transmitted by neurons to the center of vision at the back of the brain. The act of seeing actually takes place in this center in the brain. All the images we view in our lives and all the events we experience are actually experienced in this tiny and dark place. Both the film you are now watching and the boundless landscape you see when you gaze at the horizon actually fit into this place of a few cubic centimeters. Now, let us reconsider this information more carefully. When we say we see, we actually see the effect the rays reaching our eyes form in our brain by being converted into electric signals. When we say we see, we actually observe the electrical signals in our brain. By the way, there is another point that has to be kept in mind. The brain is sealed to light, and its interior is absolutely dark. Therefore, it is never possible for the brain to contact with light itself. We can explain this interesting situation with an example. Let us suppose that in front of us there is a burning candle, and we view its light. During this period, when we view the candle's light, the inside of our skull and our brain are in absolute darkness. The light of the candle never illuminates our brain and our center of vision. However, we watch a colorful and bright world inside our dark brain. The same situation applies to all our other senses. Sound, touch, taste, and smell are all perceived in the brain as electrical signals. Therefore, our brains, throughout our lives, do not confront the original of the matter existing outside us, but rather an electrical copy of it formed inside our brain. It is at this point that we are misled by assuming these copies are instances of real matter outside us.
It's enough to make the point. It's, once again, it's on my playlist if you want to see more. So is that true, or is that just one of those freaky YouTube videos where they're just making stuff up? As far as my understanding of how vision takes place, that was spot on. And that's even a materialistic explanation, but it can't escape what's happening. Because photons are physical, and they're saying photons actually travel off objects, and they hit our lens, and there's actually like little atomic shuttles that carry photons into our receptors. That photon is then converted into a bioelectrical signal that travels through our brain, and then we interpret that signal to be red, yellow, light, dark, soft, hard, sweet, sour. I mean, so when I ask the question, where are you seeing me right now? It's not 3 feet in front of you, 10 feet in front of you. I'm in your heads. How did I get in your heads? That's a really freaky thing to think about. The video goes on, there's about another 15 minutes, but that was enough. That was some freaky music. I didn't really notice the music before. But they go on to say, what if you just took a brain and put it in a vat and hooked it up to electrodes, and we're just like, oh, there's the smell of vanilla. Oh, there's the taste of an apple. Oh, and we've already mapped the brain well enough where people can go in and stimulate parts of your brain, and people will smell or taste or remember different memories. Or they can show them slides or pictures or videos, and people will conjure up all this information, but it's all being generated inside your brain. And so this becomes this huge mess. Where is reality? Is it inside or outside? And so we have this either or sort of thing. Locke is like, no, it's all out there, and we're part of out there. And Berkeley's like, oh no, it's all in there, and we're all a part of in there. Because the ultimate in there is God's mind, right? We just become modes of extension, kind of like Spinoza's sort of thing of God's thoughts. We're like thinking God's thoughts after him in a sort of way. So you can see the objective and subjective applications. On a subjective level, what you perceive, little p perceive, is your little r reality. So if you're these like little modes of existence within God, God's reality is big. Our reality is little. Little r reality, capital R reality. Capital P perception gets you capital R reality. Little p perception gives you little r reality. And that's when I'm talking about subjective objective, that's what I'm talking about, the difference between this point of view and the totality of all points of view at the same time. Okay, but we're working our way there. The next guy up is David Hume, who is a Scottish philosopher. And I'm not going to say a lot about him simply because his contribution was more a critique and a takedown of the people who came before him. And there is value to that. And he returns to the ancient skepticism of the Greeks we talked about. He was so skeptical, in fact, that he even denied the premise of cause and effect. He said, for all we know, it's just coincidence that every time you see lightning, you hear thunder. It doesn't mean lightning's causing thunder. It just happens to mean they're happening in close proximity to each other. He even uses the illustration of pool balls. When you see the cue ball hit one of the other balls, the cue ball stops and now the other ball's moving. But he says, you can't demonstrate or prove that that one ball is causing that other ball to move. Yes, it happens time and time again, but you don't know if it's going to happen next time. We simply assume that sort of thing. And people are like, come on, Hume, are you serious? Are you really that skeptical that you don't even believe you necessarily have a real body, or that we're on a real planet, or that there's real trees, and he's like, I live with this assumption, like I know, I can't know, so I just pick to choose what I believe, and I'm going to live accordingly. And it's interesting, but Kant, the next guy up, does not want to revert back to the skepticism, where we throw up our hands in despair and say, there's too many competing ideas, we're like philosophically paralyzed, it's like a checkmate, we can't move. Enter Immanuel Kant, whose name means God with us, right? Immanuel Kant. And I'm going to leave these two up, but Immanuel Kant, he's living in the 18th century. He's writing about the time of the American Revolutionary War, like the 1770s, etc. And when he was reading, I believe he was reading Copernicus, and also David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, the skeptic, he said, I awoke from my dogmatic slumber, because he was caught in this like Aristotelian either or, like one of these guys has to be right. But just like realizing there's a moon going around Jupiter, he begins to think, is it possible that there could be a real external world, but we really are the ones bringing it into reality, at least in our own minds? And so he starts to think in this both and sort of reasoning. And part of his both and reasoning, he doesn't want it to be this either or, but he doesn't want to become this Spinozian pantheist either. And so what he does, he talks about a distinction between phenomena and noumena. Anyone want to tell me what either of those words mean? Will someone check the spelling on noumena for me, because I'm pretty sure I butchered that one. Okay, phenomena is that which you can perceive. So anything with your senses or even your thoughts, that is the phenomenal world, the world of experience. Noumena are things as they actually are. And this is what Kant wants to point out. He says, it's like we're wearing glasses or goggles. If you think the world you see is the world as it is, Kant would call you a naive realist. He says, what's actually happening is much more like that video I just showed you, is there is a world out there, but it passes through you and you order it to what makes sense to a human being. If I was lecturing a classroom full of pit vipers right now, you would all have little heat sensors on the sides of your faces, and you would be picking up my heat signature. And you would be able to distinguish my heat signature from every other heat signature in the room. And your brain would be translating that heat signature into images that you could understand and that would help you survive or find food, whatnot. If this was a classroom full of bats, you would all be chirping at me, picking up sonar images that your brain would be interpreting as this bearded hermit gnome standing before you. But because you're humans and you're not vipers or bats, you're mostly using your eyes and then your ears. That's mostly how you guys are picking up this information. But the same thing, you're taking it into your brain, and your brain is converting it into an electrical impulse, and that is being interpreted into tones, pitch, smells, sound, all this sorts of thing is going on. And so Kant does something really novel in the Western world at this point, and he says it's not either or, it's not Locke or Berkeley, but it's both and. They're both right. But this is also why Kant is the last of the modern philosophers, because with this type of thinking, it opens the doorway to postmodernism. Because now it's not this black and white, either or this or that. you're beginning to look at how do these two things work together into a whole. But that's a much more Eastern, inclusive way of thinking, where Western philosophy has been very discriminatory, exclusive. We're trying to see in the West how things are different or unique. In the East, philosophy tends to look at how are things interconnected, how do they work together. And so you're gonna see this play out big time in the second part of the class. But Kant is about as Western a philosopher as you can get. He is the most rational, logical, empirical sort of guy, but he understands humans are limited. We're only seeing a little piece of the picture. And with intellectual, philosophical humility, we need to acknowledge that we are simply seeing the world as it appears to us. But if we start making truth claims that that's the actual world, he would say, stop being ignorant. Think about the color spectrum or the light spectrum. It's huge. But humans have like mid-range vision. But we know because of other tools and lenses that there's ultraviolet and infrared and beyond, right? But those are like just outside of our vision spectrums. But there's other creatures amongst us that have infrared vision, like the pit vipers, or ultraviolet vision, like many insects. I used to show this video in here called The Invisible Universe, and it would put different filters on cameras so you could see what you normally couldn't see with the naked human eye. And the one that has stuck with me all these years, they showed this field of white wildflowers. And they were pretty, but just very plain white flowers. But when they put the ultraviolet lens on the camera, these white flowers, all of a sudden, the center became just this black, almost like target. And then on the petals were almost like landing strips pointing to where the nectar was, or the pollen. Okay, the arrows are my addition. But besides that, it's just, you're just going, what? And you're beginning to realize this world isn't really just about us. We are in this world, we have our place, we have a role, but it's just this little tiny piece. There's so much more out there beyond what we can see or perceive. And that's part of the beauty of science. As we get better microscopes, better telescopes, different things of looking at the world in a macro or micro way, it expands our understanding and awareness. But even with the best tools, we have to acknowledge the fact we're limited in what we can perceive and what we can know. But Berkeley is also correct in that we are the ones who order the world in which we live. We are the ones that are making these values, these judgments, these tastes, these smells. This is part of this subjective personal interaction. And so Kant is saying both and, embrace both, because that is the fundamental nature of reality. Okay, questions, comments? Please, guys, yes?
Noumena is N-O-U-M.
So it's right besides that O?
Yep.
Thank you. I will try to remember that. Noumena. So phenomena and noumena. Kant said there's two presuppositions that we're kind of like born with. And it's not even possible to think without them. And these he calls space and time. And think about it. If I say my mug is on the table, I don't have to say at 12 noon on 2/20/2020, I got to say it in the lecture, that's great, 2/20/2020. It's assumed it's happening in space and time. So I don't have to say on planet Earth, North American continent, the country of the United States of America, the state of California, the location Southern California, Santee, at 200 Riverview Drive in building B, classroom 205 on the next to the lectern. I don't have to do all that. It's just assumed if I'm talking about my mug, it's happening at a certain place and a certain time. So here's a question for you. Have you ever been or thought outside of space and time? In one of my favorite existential movies, I Heart Huckabees, these existential detectives asked this client, they said, have you ever thought outside of space and time? And he said, space, yes, but time, no. No, I have no idea what you're talking about. The thing is, even if you could think outside of space and time, it's like Plato's cave. That's out in the full light of day. Anything you learn there, once you came back into the cave, how are you going to talk about outside of space and time with beings that live in space and time? You can't. You have to talk to them in space and time terms. And I think this is part of the problem we have with the scriptures and understanding God trying to interact with man. Humans are occurring in space and time, which, as I already talked about, I see time as like this subset or bracket in eternity. But if God is dwelling in eternity, he is before time, in time, and after time. He's all time, all the time, everywhere now, everywhere present. Other comments, questions? But those are just two filters. I actually think this is where Kant might have not been quite as aware, and this is the problem when you live in a monoculture, where everyone looks like you, thinks, although no one thought like Kant. I mean, he was head and shoulders above even the other philosophers of his day. In fact, a lot of them had a hard time even understanding him. But I don't think Kant was aware of other filters that we wear. Give me some other ones that affect the way we perceive reality. Race? Ethnicity? Gender?
Religion?
Yeah. Do you think I see America the same way African Americans see America?
No.
I can't, because I'm not African American.
Thank you for saying that, by the way.
Oh, you're welcome. But on the same hand, none of you know what it's like to see America from like this bearded white gnome perspective, unless you're bearded white gnome. It just has to do with perspective, where I'm standing, what I've experienced, how people treat me. Do you think I understand what it's like to be a woman? Heaven's sakes, no. Now, I can listen to women, I can try to be sympathetic to women, but there is no way I'm going to tell a woman, oh, I know just how you feel. Yeah, oh, childbirth, tell me about it, right? I mean, give me a break. I would be a fool and would deserve a punch in the nose if I start telling women I know what it's like, their struggle, or that sort of thing, or different ethnicities, or immigrants, or whatever. So, but then what else do we have? What about age? Think how differently if you saw that chapel I gave, and I used the example of Witten and his grandson on the beach. They're on the same stinking beach, but he's, knocking on 70, and his grandson's knocking on 7. You think they're really walking on the same beach? No. At least not the one they're perceiving. Socioeconomics, you think that affects the way you... What about languages? How you speak, it's going to be like your world is going to be affected by your education. All these are, your religion, politics, all these things are filter after filter. And part of what I'm trying to do as a philosopher is to pull people's glasses off and try to get them to look at the world again in a different way without these presuppositions. But it's so hard. Now, this is part of what critical thinking is about. You first have to become aware of your own biases and prejudices and presuppositions. If you can't do that, you can't even begin to think critically. The despair, of course, is we can't have clear lenses. Because even if we get rid of the politics, the religion, the ideologies, there's still things beyond my control, like gender, ethnicity, things like that I can't change. There's nothing I can do about that particular, although that may be changing too, right? In the very near future. We'll talk about that later, maybe in my other class. I love what Kant's doing here, and it does open the door for postmodern philosophy. And so next class, what I'm going to cover is we're going to talk about Hegel, and he borrows a lot from John Scotus Erigena, and I realize I forgot a couple things to tell you about John Scotus, but I'll bring that up the next class. And then we're going to talk about the two most powerful philosophy ideologies of the 20th century, and that was Marxism and existentialism. And they're still duking it out today in different iterations. In fact, this new election cycle, we're going to see different variations of both of those happening. The rugged individualism versus the collectivism, right? The Borg versus, no, I'm my own man or woman, don't tell me what to do. And so that should be very interesting and pertinent. Last chance for questions? All right, well, we will end with Kant on that.